we start? Okay, we'll try to start, please. Good afternoon. We're going to try to start, even though the bathroom line, is my mic on? It's not working. Good afternoon. I realize we're on a very tight schedule here, and the bathroom.
I can do it. You have your work cut out for you.
Is this working?
Okay.
Yeah.
Be quiet.
Good afternoon, and thank you for sitting down
Yeah.
and being quiet.
Do it now. Yeah, you want me to
Ready to go?
Okay.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming out to this celebration of 25 years of women writing women's lives. I'm Betty Caroli. I haven't been a member for the whole 25 years, but I think it's about 23 years, and it's been very central to my writing life. I'm reminded, as I'm sure many of you are here today, of how biography, and certainly the last panel emphasized this point, how much the writing of biography has changed in those 25 years. I know in my case, the book I just finished that's coming out this month on Lady Bird Johnson, the research was so completely different from previous books, mostly because of the internet. And I could, from the comfort of my own desk, go online and find census materials on Lady Bird's family. I could find obscure little newspapers in the part of East Texas where she grew up. And those helped fill out gaps that had existed in the research on her life. We have here today, our panel is telling the life story, and we have three distinguished biographers who are going to talk about how their writing has changed in the last few years and how they've expanded the limits of research and writing. I've been told not to give lengthy bios because you have them in front of you, so I'll just point to each one in turn, who will take her 10 minutes and talk, and then we'll have, as the last panel did, some discussion among them and then questions from the audience. So we'll start with Gail Levin, who writes about artists, and we're lucky to have her because tomorrow she leaves for India for a distinguished professorship, Fulbright professorship there, and we're back in 4 months. So Gail.
Excuse me. Rather than speak about famous women artists such as Lee Krasner or Judy Chicago, both subjects of my previous biographies, I think it useful to focus on my recovery of an earlier woman artist, Josephine Versteel Nivison, who became known as Jo N. Hopper when she wed the American painter Edward Hopper, A+1. Married for 43 years, until Edward's death in 1967, Jo, born in 1883, was less than a year younger than her husband and died in 1968. After their marriage, Jo served as her husband's only model. Her story is emblematic of a generation of women artists who never found much commercial success and have been all but erased. Jo Hopper may ultimately be remembered more as a revealing and conscientious diarist than as a painter, especially since 62 volumes of her diaries survive and very few of her paintings do. She bequeathed the remaining artistic estate of her husband and her own works to the Whitney Museum of American Art, which despite having shown her work over the years, discarded most of her canvases, giving away 100 of her best framed works, mostly to New York area hospitals, none of which kept records of donated artworks. I'm showing you the lost works in black and white only. 3 of her paintings, one here, went to New York University and remained there, this one in Hopper's former studio. All the others had disappeared by my arrival at the museum. She left her diaries, however, to a woman friend, and after narrowly escaping being destroyed after the friend's death, the diaries have been preserved. In the diaries, Jo recorded her own artistic struggles, the creative efforts of her introverted husband, and her observations of the art world and its challenges for women, all of whom faced gender discrimination, as she did from her own beloved husband, even at home. My path to Jo Hopper commenced in June 1976, after I began at the Whitney as the first and only curator of the Edward Hopper collection. Only when I had to authenticate some unsigned canvases that had been sent to an outside conservator before I arrived at the museum did I need to study Jo's art. Edward's portrait of Jo painting, sometimes recording the same subjects that appeared in his own work, raised questions of authorship for me. Which Hopper had painted these works? Although Jo appeared together with her husband in televised and recorded interviews, there were few comments about her career, no easy place to look up information on her life and work. Her contemporaries were gone, though I did interview collectors and others who had known her in her later years. She devoted herself to keeping careful records of every time Edward's artworks, which she called, quote, their children, end quote, left the studio for exhibition, sale, or gift. But she commented that her own little bastards seldom stepped out. I knew that she had posed in 1906. Oh, that's one of the little bastards. She had posed in 1906 at the New York School of Art for their teacher, Robert Henry, who made a portrait called The Art Student Seen Here, and that she and Edward had met there, but I knew little else. I started by consulting the 1900 federal census, finding the names of her mother and her Texas-born father, Eldorado Nivison, a struggling piano teacher who reported only that his only daughter was, quote, at college. College? I only knew that she attended the same art school as Edward, but calling it college, where could such a poor girl have studied in New York? I remembered that the mother of my childhood chum had gone to Hunter College and that it had once been free and for women only. I imagined that Jo could have gone there and called the archivist with possible dates. Sure enough, there she was in the class of 1904 at the Normal College of New York under President Thomas Hunter, for whom the college would be named in 1914. So you see, this is a CUNY story. She enrolled in 1900 at the age of 17. I was able to acquire her transcript with her courses and grades. She was an average student, but she got a much broader education than Edward did in art school, was active in the college's drama club, and published her drawings in 2 school publications, a magazine and the yearbook. Those reproductions of lost works showed that she had developed a marvelous Art Nouveau linear style of drawing in pen and ink. I then found that the New York City directories documented Jo's family's frequent moves, probably in search of rent incentives. Later, I discovered Jo Nivison as an actor in the avant-garde theater company, the Washington Square Players. From one of her chance remarks in an interview, I learned that in 1918, she continued acting lessons in New York with the famous singer Yvette Gilbert, who had arrived from Toulouse-Lautrec's Paris. Looking in Haarlem, the Netherlands, for Edward Hopper's signature in the sign-in books for visitors to the Frans Hals collection of paintings, I found Jo's name instead. She had traveled there in 1907 as a member of Henry's landscape and portrait classes, having earned her way by recruiting the other members of the class. Much later, the cache of diaries that Jo kept for most of her married life turned up in a private collection. I collected the letters she wrote to many friends and found further clues. A few tattered and yellow clippings reproducing her published drawings survived with some of her original drawings at the Whitney because they were mixed in with Edward's drawings and not tossed out. One of the clippings was her 1914 drawing for The Masses, an important socialist magazine where John Sloan was the art editor. I knew that Jo had worked as an elementary teacher in the New York City public schools and found her records in special collections at Columbia Teachers College, and that she had left in 1918 to work in France for what turned out to be the American Expeditionary Forces in a government program for wounded and disabled soldiers from World War I. I discovered a cache of documents in the U.S. Office of Personal Management in St. Louis, Missouri. What a thrill each new discovery was. Like a treasure hunt, I was the first to put together the pieces of this puzzle. In the course of my research, I realized that I was uncovering a feminist bombshell and anticipated some of the resistance that would come from the male-dominated art establishment. This caption writer in the New York Times was mild-mannered in labeling Edward, quote, mean man with a brush, referring to his abuse of Jo, both physical and mental. But she fought back. Once I found Jo Hopper's diaries, I asked Knopf, the publisher, to allow me to include her name in the biography's title, +1. Their response was an emphatic no. Women, too, often wanted only the story of the famous man, or as did women of her day who dismissed Jo for having had such a famous husband. Though anticipated, some of the anti-feminist reception to the book galvanized my feminist identity. Today, having written Jo's story into my 1995 biography of Edward Hopper, I have the satisfaction of reading about her in her own Wikipedia article. A few more of her lost works have turned up. Propelled by my imagination and then searching in diverse archives on 2 continents, I succeeded in inscribing Jo Nivison into art history by pulling together the suppressed story of this forgotten but significant woman artist and diarist. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Our next panelist is Ruth Franklin, who most of you know as a critic for New York Times, Book Review, Atlantic, and formerly of New Republic. But she'll be talking today about her own book on Shirley Jackson.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Wow, Gail, what a difficult story to follow. I was so moved by that story, and also kind of its resonances for the story of Shirley Jackson's life, and I'm sure so many of the women that we've written about and have read about. It's very humbling for me to be here about a year before my first biography is about to come out, in the presence of so many much more deeply experienced women who I've had the honor of learning from, both in person and from your words. So I ask your forbearance with my own lack of experience as I speak a little bit about the challenges that I've faced in teasing out a narrative number one, as a literary critic whose first tendency is to want to write about literature and interpretation, and second, of a woman writer who, until relatively recently, I feel has been neglected and underappreciated. So I probably don't have to introduce Shirley Jackson too much to this audience. I'll just say briefly, of course, she was the author of The Lottery, her most famous short story published by The New Yorker in 1948, and also, of course, of a number of significant novels, including The Haunting of Hill House from 1959, a classic of American literary horror and suspense, and We Have Always Lived in the Castle, her final completed novel in 1962. And as a critic, I'm always, of course, interested in how to interpret these works, but also in the story behind the works. What was going on in the writer's life at the time that she was writing, what books she read, who were the people she met who contributed to her creations. And as the biographer of a writer who I guess might be called moderately neglected, that is generally positioned outside the critical canon of so-called important writers, this proved more difficult than I expected. The first challenge was, I'm going to talk about 3 major challenges that came up over the course of writing this book. The first challenge was truly a basic one that I hadn't expected. The simple challenge of setting Shirley Jackson's works within an exact timeline. The chronology, of course, being so essential a place for any biographer to start. And I foolishly believed, because Jackson has quite a comprehensive archive that was preserved at the Library of Congress and is very accessible. It was preserved because the library actually was interested in the papers of her husband, the literary critic Stanley Edgar Hyman, and asked for hers as kind of a twofer. Now his papers are stored off-site and hers are kept in the main collection, but that's just a side note. I was foolish enough to think that because this archive existed, I wasn't going to have any problems. Of course, many drafts were undated. There hadn't been any scholarly work done on these papers to try to organize them or, construct different forms of either the novels or the stories. About a year ago, Richard Holmes spoke from this stage, giving the Leon Levy lecture, talking about, among other things, his classic biography of Shelley. And one thing he said was how grateful he was to all the editors of Shelley's letters and poetry and scholarly works, all the scholarly editions that had come before his biography and made his work possible. And it wasn't really until I heard him say that, then I thought, oh, this is why I'm having so much trouble. There hasn't been anybody to do this work. And so that was an unanticipated roadblock that I had to overcome before even being able to construct a chronological narrative of such a basic question of in what order were these stories written. And of course, this won't surprise anybody here. Jackson being a female writer, I had to come up with creative ways to date these stories, using many primary sources, including confirmations from her agents that they had received stories in different forms. Other basic things were hampered by the fact that the correspondence between Jackson and her agents hadn't been preserved in a public manner. All that was in Jackson's archive, of course, were the letters that she had received, not the ones that she had sent to her agents. Her agency, which had gone through various forms since she was their client, didn't know what had happened to her part of the file. And I didn't find it until several months ago, at literally the 11th hour for my research, when on a hunch I had decided once again to ask a member of her family if he had any idea, again, finally, where these letters might be. And he said, oh yes, there is a box in my garage that I've never opened. The box is now in my office. Another source, again, which will not surprise most people in this room, was her husband's correspondence. And again, I had foolishly thought that since hers was the main archive and his was the secondary one at this point, that his would not be as useful. And of course, her husband, as a literary critic, was writing to many other distinguished critics and writers of his own generation, many of whom also had archives that preserved his letters. Sometimes they preserved her letters too. They just didn't mention them in the finding aid because they were filed under his letters. So I learned that I had to search every archive, not only for her letters, but also for his. When I did turn up only his letters, they often contained a note about what his wife had been up to. And by that means, I was able to enter to date an important trilogy of short stories that Jackson wrote in the late 40s that, in fact, I hadn't known were intended as a trilogy because they hadn't been published as such, and she hadn't written about them as such. She never wrote any kind of interpretation of her own writing. It was only from her husband's writings that I gleaned that they were, in fact, meant to be three portions of a larger project. Of course, there were other pitfalls to looking through his files, but another unexpected bonus was that the archivist had listed in his finding aid an unpublished novella. I thought, what could this unpublished novella be? Stanley Hyman didn't write novels. I looked at it, and it was, in fact, a draft of Jackson's second novel, Hangs a Man, which you would think an archivist who was working on her husband's papers might have recognized. So challenge 2, once I had this timeline going, was the question of how to fit these works into the narrative of her life. Not just from a literary critical perspective, but of course from the perspective of a human being who was also a writer. And again, as usual, sources came up in unexpected places, and I'll just tell one story, which is my favorite from these books. And I thought of it as Gail was talking about Jo Hopper apparently making the very fortunate choice to leave her diaries to a female friend. I had a similar situation in that one day at random, I was doing research in Jackson's archive, and I discovered that there are two thick folders of letters from a woman whose name I didn't recognize, who hadn't come up anywhere else. And I started reading the letters, and it was clear as soon as I'd read a few pages that whatever Jackson had been writing to her was extraordinary, that it was intimate and detailed and highly personal on a level that Jackson had not communicated with anyone else as far as I knew. And this was a person whose name I couldn't, I'd never heard before, and I was able to place from the letters of hers that Jackson had, of course, carefully saved, as she saved almost everything, that this woman was a housewife in Baltimore, Maryland, who had started their correspondence by writing Jackson a fan letter. And it blossomed from there. These women discovered each other as kindred spirits and became pen pals. And it was especially significant because they wrote these letters while Jackson was writing We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And the letters, contained a story, Jackson's own story of her writing struggle at the same time as she was offering this woman as well a chronicle of their household and stories about their children. They each had 4 children who they exchanged stories about, complaints about their husbands, which is a whole other subject I won't even get into here. So immediately, of course, I started scouring the internet for this woman's descendants, and I was able to find one of them still living in Maryland. But she told me, unfortunately, her mother had died about a year and a half before, and everything had been put into a dumpster. So my heart was broken, but you have, unfortunately, as all of you know, these disappointments are simply a fact of life. When writing a woman's biography, you move on. And then, 9 months after that, I got a call from this woman who had been told that her mother's country property in Pennsylvania was about to go up for auction, and she had just remembered that there was a storage barn on the property where her mother had kept papers. And she and I met there the next day because I wasn't taking any chances. And after 2 days of searching through the barn, we found Jackson's letters to her mother in a filing cabinet. And it was the most rewarding experience of the 5 years that I've spent working on this biography. These letters have been carefully kept in this filing cabinet in an outbuilding on this property, and we're simply waiting for someone to come and find them. And indeed, they constituted about 60 pages, 60 typed pages, some of them single-spaced. that provide in great detail a chronicle of that very important year and a half to 2 years while Jackson was writing probably her most significant novel. So I'm probably running out of time.
Yes, you are, but
And
you
so
can
I
wrap it
will
up.
wrap up. The last thing that I was going to mention was that the final challenge is the story of how Jackson's works were received by critics at the time and how they continue to be received now. And I think that's probably something that we all have something to speak about. And so I will table that for our panel discussion.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker is Sally Bingham, who's written, as you can see from your programs, a lot. But I noticed that today your topic, Doris Duke, is the only one of us up here on this stage you are writing about a woman who does not live in the shadow of a man. And so we're eager to hear what you have to say about your work on Doris Duke.
Thank you, Betty. This is a biography. It's actually my first biography. I've been primarily a fiction writer. Oh, can you hear me, all of you? This book is a biography which will be published by Farrar Straus next spring. It's called Doris Duke, The Invention of the New Woman. And as you may guess, that's a title that I really have to work to make fit this biography. Doris Duke was not in the shadow of a man. She was in the shadow of a great and notorious fortune, which is almost worse than being in the shadow of a man. She's been entirely defined in terms of her money, what people imagine about her life, and it has been particularly difficult to write this biography because although she left 800 linear feet of paper files to the Rubenstein Library at Duke University, there is almost nothing in those 800 linear feet that she wrote herself. So this is the particular problem for many of us of writing about women who were written about but didn't write about themselves. She had many reasons for not writing about herself. Primary was that she felt she had no education. Extraordinary when you think of a daughter of the Gilded Age, but not so extraordinary in terms of women's lives of that period. She had 4 years at Brearley. Brearley is the most discreet fortress any biographer ever tried to penetrate. They know nothing. They will say nothing. They have no records. I did, however, find some of her own school records. And then she had a year at finishing school, so she basically probably had about a 7th or 8th grade education. Her father was the founder of Duke University. Her father made his money off the creation of the cigarette. He is responsible for the deaths of literally millions of people across the world. That was her heritage, which she had great difficulty struggling with. It wasn't her fault that he created the cigarette, but she was the beneficiary of his enormous income. So she spent her life trying to define herself, I think never entirely satisfactorily, and didn't understand that since she didn't write anything virtually, other people would rush in to define her, which they have now for the decades during her life and after her death in 1993. It's not entirely true to say she wrote nothing. I think there are 4 of her memoranda about herself in the archive at Duke. One of them was a response to a very ambiguous figure. She had many ambiguous figures in her life, named Mike Shaningo, a CIA operative, who asked her why she wanted to be in Italy at the end of World War II to report on the end of the war there. And she's told him, why does anyone want to do something constructive in life? My ambition has been to do something on my own and to learn to know people in all walks of life. It's bound to be more difficult for me to write than for other people, because editors might be more interested in my name than in my substance. I'm inclined to take this at face value since I know something about being taken for my name rather than my substance. But is that enough? It's barely a scrap in a 380-page biography. But it was about as far as she was ever willing to go. that left me to try to sift through the multitudinous letters that were written to her, primarily by her male lovers. She was a woman a little bit ahead of her time. She came of age in the jazz age and probably thought that she was going to have a little freer life than in fact she ended up having. So there are many letters from lovers, and of course, how do we as biographers judge letters from lovers, or is judgment even appropriate in that situation? I'll read you a little bit from one of the ones that I felt was most illustrative of who she was in her 20s and 30s. This is a man who adored her for her whole life. She had a brief fling with him. His name was Tex McCreary. He went on to run a very well-known and popular radio show in the 50s with his wife Jinx. It was called Hi Jinx, just to make you laugh. And he wrote Doris years before that, "I thought you were pretty. I liked your eyes. I liked the way you tried and tried to do things, like the time I stood and watched you diving over and over at Santa Barb. I liked the way you laughed all over, like a very big puppy shaking off water. I liked your long fingers. I liked your impatience with formality. I liked your perception of counterfeit people, and I would have liked very much to have pulled and hauled you into a roaring love affair because my intentions were always strictly dishonorable." I love that description because one of the cliches that I always deal with in writing about Doris Duke is that rich women are lazy. And it seems as though if she was trying to learn how to dive over and over and over, maybe she wasn't lazy. So I was inclined to take at face value the descriptions that fit what I felt were a newer way of looking at women with inherited money. After all, there was a lot about Doris Duke that was what she did with her inherited money. Some of you may know that she established what is the great center for Islamic studies in Hawaii. It's the house she built there called Shangri-La. She began on her honeymoon to collect Islamic art of every possible description, and she put together a collection that actually rivals the new wing at the Met. And some of you may have had the great advantage of seeing part of the collection when it was in New York a year and a half ago. This was for a woman with an 8th grade education whose family had no interest in that part of the world, were solely interested in climbing up the ladder in New York and building a big house on 78th and 5th that some of you have probably seen. But she branched out, and she had the incredible originality, from my point of view, to move behind what people like the Havemeyers of her parents' generation were doing, which was, of course, collecting European masters. She had no interest in European masters or tapestries or silver, or she did have some interest in jewelry. And then she also took over her parents' house in Rhode Island called Rough Point. If anybody has been to Newport, it is open to the public. It was a typical Gilded Age house, and she did not make a great many changes there. But one of the things that's so touching, if you go to look at it, it's open to the public, is in her bedroom are the 3 tiny little silver trophies that as a child she won for tango, tennis, and building sandcastles. She kept them her whole life, and it was to me such an example of her, I don't really want to say humility, I don't think anybody has any business being humble, but of her ability to stay in some kind of context rather than leaping out of it into the context that most of us subscribe to women of great wealth. Her final gift to the public was a farm in Somerville, New Jersey called the Duke Farms. Some of you may have visited. It is becoming an example of conservation. Her fortune, which she increased 3 times from what her father left her, went to the Doris B. Duke Charitable Foundation. I'm sure some of you hear of it thanked on NPR quite regularly. It's a $1.3 billion foundation headquartered here in New York, and it goes to support the 3 houses that are open to the public and the Center for Islamic Studies, and to make very notable gifts to the arts, particularly modern dance. Something all of you here, I think, might be interested in learning more about if you don't already know about it. So my aim in writing this biography, I hope, will be achieved, which is to explode some of the cliches about women who inherit money. It also, interestingly enough, reinforces the idea of a singular kind of female genius that doesn't really have anything much to do with either education or background. Probably has to do with the fact that Doris really liked to move her body. Thank you.
Thank you. So you've all written about 20th century American women, but I think that might be their only point of commonality, no? Do you have questions for each other or points you wanted to make about what each of us said? Gail? Oh,
Is it turned off now?
Here, why don't you use mine?
I just wanted to say that I liked very much both of your papers, and I have to say that I'm envious of you having had these wonderful archives and finding these caches in, well, but of course, Ruth, you found it in a garage, so that's more like my encounters. But I was both for Edward Hopper studies, not a woman, but looking for Joe there. There were no Hopper archives either. I had to create them at the Whitney by collecting all of the material in other archives and putting copies there. And so for Joe, always in the shadow, it's a challenge. And I'm also interested, Sally, in your sort of autobiographical relationship to your subject, which I think is a great driver. And perhaps we all have it, but we don't always know it.
I can't escape it, unfortunately. It's so class-bound, and I always try to remind people who assume that I somehow have the same background as Doris Duke. The similarity in our background is that it's all nouveau. And also greatly different in terms of the size.
Yeah, one of the things I was really touched by in your talk was your description of the way an act of empathy can unearth information that hadn't been known before. As when you were saying, when you said that you discovered that Joe went to the normal college because you thought about where might a woman of little means go at that time, and that was what you came up with. And I wonder, I'd love to hear from either of you, and Betty as well, if obviously all biographers have to rely on hunches in such a way, but I wonder if it's more of a if it's more of an important component for women biographers, simply because generally we have a dearth of information that requires us, to be more imaginative in searching for clues in the archive. I don't think I've heard any female biographer complain of being overwhelmed by archive information. And Sally, I thought about that when you were talking too. You examine these letters from lovers for the chance remark that illuminates your subject's personality, right? And it's a very similar kind of impulse in here.
The hunch for me is that this woman has been erased. And I always notice that. It's certainly true with Doris Duke as well as many other women. When I began going down to Duke University, I established an archive there for women's papers. This was 25 years ago or 20 years ago. I noticed that on this great elaborate campus, there are many busts of her father, her uncle, her brothers, her nephews. I can't even tell you how many male dukes are parading around in black marble. There isn't even a single sketch of Doris Duke. Not only the daughter of the founder, but a major benefactor. And so I began to ask, well, who was she? Why is there no representation here? And there was a notable silence. And that always draws me, because I know some story of significance has been erased. And that's what started me.
Well, I had a hunch problem with the Lady Bird book The standard treatment of her in the biographies of Lyndon Johnson, the standard treatment is that her mother died when she was 5 years old, leaving her very stranded. And the mother died when she fell down a flight of steps, pregnant. She was 44 years old, tripped by a dog, fell down the steps and died. And that story never really, the Johnsons would say, that dog didn't hunt, that didn't work. It didn't square with me. And so I went to the town and I tried to find out what happened in 1918 when this woman died. And I found a great hole of information. I mean, the newspapers for those periods, the only newspaper in the town, all the files were missing. The church where she went said that she had no funeral. That was very unusual. So I started talking to people, what could it have been? And then I went and got her birth certificate in the local courthouse, and it said she died of blood poisoning. Now, those of us who know women's history from that period know that blood poisoning was a common cause of death when women tried to abort using metal objects. So I thought, I also knew that the mother had sent her 2 sons away to boarding schools, so she didn't see them for years at a time, and that she had made plans already to send Lady Bird, who was not called Lady Bird at that time, away to a boarding school. So it all added up in the missing records, the lack of church records, no funeral held, the cause of death. So I speculate in the book that she died of a botched abortion. But of course we can never know without an autopsy. I guess the question is, do we make hunches more in writing women's biography than in writing men's? And I have a feeling if the father had died of something, we would have very good records of what he died of, right? And it wouldn't have been erased from the newspaper. Of course, the circumstances of the abortion in 1918 would have made it a special case. Anyway, that's my hunch story.
The lacuna, the absence of attention paid to so many women who might be in the shadow of a man or just a family or whatever, it leads to speculation and invention, but not always, well, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of, I think, male biographers who want to diminish the woman or put her in her place. And I found that with Lee Krasner, where Pollock biographers actually put a dialogue from an unrelated novel, not based on Krasner, according to the novelist, into her mouth as direct quotation. So I have a note on sources sort of blowing the whistle on that, which I had to struggle with the publisher to include because it's, quote, scholarly and it's placed in the back of the book. And recently I had someone write to me to raise questions, the same kind of questions I was trying to illuminate with those the note on sources. They hadn't even found it in the back of the book. And it basically answered their questions. So I think, imagination and speculation can be very productive and very benign, or it can be used by others for more nefarious reasons.
Anything else, or shall we open questions to...
I'd like to say one more thing. I noticed with Doris Duke's story that because of the lacuna, the silence, that the prejudices of her time rushed in. One of the things that she was constantly berated about was her relationships with dark-skinned people, both lovers and friends. She had a remarkable lack of the prejudices of her period. And in fact, there was a magazine in LA, I think it's gone, called Confidential, that in the 50s put together a front page in which she was put next to an African man who was actually her chauffeur, and there was an article about the fact that they were lovers. So she fell victim, and I think this always happens when there is a silence to the prejudices of her times, which were extraordinarily damaging for her, and the kind of thing to which she could really make no response. At some point there's no use saying it didn't happen or that wasn't me or whatever. She just was really victimized in that way. And I think that often happens when there is a silence, that whatever the ugliness of that period is rushes in to fill that silence.
Yeah, if I could just say one other thing about the lacuna that I see in Jackson's life is the lacuna where she's not mentioned in the literary canon. And where, you know, where the major novelists of the 50s generally considered are, you know, and the 60s, of course, are Bellow, you know, Mailer, Philip Roth, I could go on. But in, you know, in most treatments of literature of the period, Jackson gets maybe a page in a chapter about women writers. And so it's been part of the challenge of my work has been to kind of pull her out of that corner and try to situate her and position her in a more prominent way. And it's become clear as I read the contemporaneous criticism, you know, the reviews of her work that were written by critics at the time and follow those critical debates, that simply the reason she was ignored was because her writing was so squarely focused on women's issues, which of course were seen as marginal. And an interesting part of that is the debate over Ralph Ellison's novel Invisible Man, which came out in 1953. Ellison actually was a close friend of both Jackson and her husband, Stanley Hyman, and they were involved in his work on that novel. But it's fascinating to see that a novel written by an African-American man in 1953 was easier for white critics, white male critics, to understand as universal, as somehow applying to every man, than novels by a white woman who was, you know, writing from a position that they ought to have been so familiar with.
The emergence of these women from the shadows, as we biographers pull them out, can be and has been perceived as very threatening by a lot of the audience. Not all of them male, but often.
Okay, shall we open to questions from the audience? Please go to one of the two microphones so everybody can hear your question, and we'll see what we can do. Listen.
Start us off. It seems to me that the three presenters raise interesting autobiographical issues with regard to their writing. That is, Sally didn't tell us all about her memoirs, of which she's written a number, and how her reflections about her own life were critical for her understanding of Doris Duke's life. Ruth has been a critic a good part of her life, and therefore was keenly aware of the kinds of criticism that Shirley Jackson faced when her novels and her stories for women's magazines came out in conjunction with each other. And Gail, of course, in terms of understanding the problems of women and art, brought that from her first instance of looking for Jo in the story of Edward Hopper to her then pursuit of a great many wonderful books on women artists. So please comment.
Dorothy, I think you hit the nail on the head. For me, with the autobiographical, because I grew up in the Deep South in a Jewish family that privileged the male child and forbade me to become a painter, forbade me to become an artist. And Jo was actually told not to paint by her husband, so again in the home. And I wasn't thinking about it at the time, but clearly I identified and empathized and decided to champion her and recover her for history.
Yes, Dorothy, you didn't leave us that much to say about our motivations. But yes, I mean, I would say, and I wonder again if this is a question of empathy that's exclusive to women's biography or simply maybe more dominant. That it's probably not a mystery to any of us why we settle on the subjects whom we do, because even if there are superficial dissimilarities, there's obviously going to be something beneath the surface that we feel we have a uniquely intimate perspective on and relationship to.
And for me, my last book, published by Saraband Books 2 years ago, is called The Blue Box, Three Lives in Letters. And is based on a box of letters that were in the top of my mother's closet when she died, from the women in her family, her grandmother, her mother, and herself. I was particularly interested because nobody had known this box even existed. And these were women my mother very rarely mentioned. She was completely taken over by my father's much more well-known and wealthier family. So my grandmother and my great-grandmother were hidden deeply in the shadows, and they were very interesting women, rabid racists in Virginia before and during and after the Civil War. So I felt as though I was digging them out of something that would certainly have ended up in the dumpster if it hadn't been that I said it shouldn't go to the dumpster. So I've always felt that the lives of women, no matter who they are, tend to be deeply hidden, and that fascinates me.
Okay, Jill, I believe it is over here, yes?
Thank you all. Just wonderful session. Sally, could you say something a bit more about Duke's education in her teens? Today, Brearley, for example, has a high school. I'm assuming from what you're saying that it didn't in her time. So you said she finishes there in 7th or 8th grade, goes to finishing school. Is she taken for a tour of either this country or the continent and so forth?
She did have a good deal of travel in Europe, particularly with her parents before her father died. Her father died when she was 13, and that's when she inherited the first third of this vast fortune. And after that, her mother, Nanaline, took her for a sort of year of mourning abroad, but that seemed to be pretty much the end of the foreign travel until she married, and then she began traveling very extensively. She did have a French governess who was very, very important to her, and was with her from about age 9 till she married.
Which was at what age?
She married at 25. A little bit late, as a matter of fact. So she had, I think, the kind of education that maybe was more typical for that time in that class, which was a lot of going to the museums. That's how she was first introduced to Islamic art, was at the Metropolitan through a collection that had been donated by a man who was working for Tiffany. And also seeing a lot of movies. She was very movie struck. She was very fond of Rudolph Valentino and ended up buying his house in Hollywood, Falcon's Lair. So her education was very peculiar in that way. She was never much of a reader. She spoke beautiful French. She was really bilingual. But it was that kind of scattershot approach where, you know, science and math were basically unheard of, and there was a little bit in the humanities and in the arts, but that was it.
Okay, over here we have, is it Belle? I can't see. Or Evelyn? Is it Evelyn? The lights in my eyes.
Hello? Audible? This is just a word of sort of self-encouragement and encouragement to others who may be have been in my position. I've written about men and the women in their lives. And one of the things I discovered is that consistently the women in these men's lives just disappear. That word erasure that we've been hearing has been part of it. I've been criticized by some of my friends for, why are you talking about them? But it's just natural, because I think we as women see women, and often men don't see men. And I say this because I know there are women here who have written biographies about men as well as women. One example, Emerson had a brilliant, influential aunt he adored, copied everything she wrote into his journals, was influenced in his writing by him, said she was the best writer of her generation in New England. It's a pretty big swath. And after he died, generation after generation, she became less and less important. When I started on him, I gave a lot of papers and published stuff on her, and I'm very happy to say, I mean, he was my focus, but because I loved him. But I'm very happy to say that along came a younger woman who got interested. She wanted to write on Mary Moody Emerson. I encouraged her. she did. There was a book put out by Oxford on that. Not because I did it, but I did open a door, I think, as other women might have in my position. Could say the same thing about some other, without going into details about my work. One of the people in my latest book erased the existence of a suicided cousin who had a big influence on the early life of my subject. We, as women, we naturally see women, and I think we have an obligation that we're happy to accept, to make those women as prominent, at least as prominent, as they were when they were alive. Thank you.
Okay. And then Kate over here.
Well, I've primarily worked on 19th century women, and one thing I've noticed is that they actually often make a very conscious attempt to make sure that their accomplishments and their colleagues' accomplishments and relatives' accomplishments are remembered, like publishing obituaries, making sure the letters are saved, writing a private memoir. So even though it may have not worked in the short term, in the long term, that material was there for people to find, and it was consciously preserved. And I'm wondering, as 20th century historians, if you sort of seen that dynamic, or biographers, not just.
Well, I've seen a Baptist preacher who lived next door to Hopper's sister raid the attic, and he's now dead, and his family still owns what should have been in the Hopper archives. And I managed to get copies of some of the material, but this was one of the greatest thefts, not just of archival material, but of artworks by Edward Hopper. One of the biggest art thefts that got away with it in the 20th century, and it's not good to die without heirs, without people really, well, I should say heirs with a deep interest, because if you just give it to some institution, if they don't pay attention, it vanishes to the most opportunistic person.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to speak on that? Well, working with presidential studies, that's the great advantage of working. Everything gets preserved or at least dug up later, so that's not a problem that I had with Lady Bird. I think over here it's a turn.
So Doris Duke was an amazing pianist, as I understand it. and
Yes.
she would go into the Newport Jazz Festival and play, right, with a lot of. So, in terms of archives, are there any? I know she had a recording machine
Yes.
at Rough Point. So, are there recordings of her playing?
Yes,
or
there
singing?
are. And I've been able to listen to some of them. The old tapes are in the Rubenstein Library. And it's very touching because her singing voice, singing these jazz standards, is a very frail soprano. And after each recording, you'll hear her saying, "So that was terrible, erase that." But her piano playing is quite different. It's vigorous. So the contrast between her singing voice and her piano playing, I thought was fascinating.
And then recordings of people during the festival at her house?
No, now they did come, but for either she didn't record them or the recordings weren't kept. I don't know which.
Yes, Alex.
It was a remarkable panel, a wonderful panel. Thank you. And I have a question for Ruth, but I want to thank Sally Bingham for having established the women's archives at Duke University. And I'm honored to have my own papers there. So thank you. Ruth, you said during your 10 minutes that there was something else you wanted to tell, but you would wait until the talk afterwards to tell it, but I don't think you have, so I wanted to give you that opportunity.
Thanks, Alex. I mean, we have touched on it a little bit, just this question of how Jackson's works were received by critics at the time, and the role of her undervaluing in my narrative of her life, which I've come to understand is precisely because of her intense and virtually exclusive focus on women's issues, which made the male critics who dominated the discussion, to dismiss or devalue her work. But one interesting aspect of the research for me was getting to know the critics who tended to, review her works over and over. These names that, sadly for us critics today, now have been mostly forgotten, but that pop up over and over again in the newspapers and magazines of the 1950s. Orville Prescott, who used to be the Times Daily Book Reviewer, Edmund Fuller, I suppose some people perhaps still remember him, and many others. In fact, one strand of the narrative was to see that in the beginning, when Jackson first started publishing her fiction, her first novel came out in 1948. I don't believe there was a single female reviewer of it. And by the time she published her sixth, We've Always Lived in the Castle in 1962, the landscape was definitely starting to change. And there were, it was certainly still dominated by male critics, but there were some women's voices out there. So take that as another encouraging little strand there.
Thank you.
I just want to comment, Ruth, that has an exact parallel in Joe Hopper's choice of subject matter and that of many other women. I showed today some domestic still lives, the woman's dresser top, and the pictures of children, and those are not male topics, and the male critics didn't like them or value them.
Right, and of course Jackson also had this very lucrative sideline, writing best-selling books and popular magazine articles about her household, her 4 children.
Yes.
Very humorous, but also kind of acerbic memoirs, which completely confounded the male critics of her time. Some of whom, were downright insulting about her choice of subject matter, and said one particularly choice comment was that when one said that his cat manages parturition without making a big fuss over it. And so he didn't understand why it was of such importance that a woman like Shirley Jackson ought to devote 2 memoirs simply to the subject of raising children.
I want to add, I used to have a collection of such misogynist book reviews from the New York Times Book Review, including when are we going to stop having to read about baby buggies in the hallway? And the great compliment to any woman writer who had the good fortune to be reviewed well was, you write like a man.
Yeah.
Yes. She was compared to Thurber on her lucky days.
Yeah.
Question over here. I'm sorry, I don't know.
What's so fascinating about your presentations among many things is the information we get, the narratives of your methodologies. And so if you teach qualitative research methods and you've gone through the institutionalized training about what they are, so much of this also is absent. We're not trained how to be inquisitive, right? I'm writing about a woman in a 1935 murder case, which was absolutely salacious at the time and still is. And I had no idea how to write about a woman in the 30s as a non-historian, let alone about a capital death penalty case. When I started to look at my archive as a PhD candidate years ago, I saw so many of my professors had actually, and women that I look up to, had actually written about famous murders. Lisa Dugan, a lesbian sapphic slasher case. Zora Neale Hurston went to Florida and wrote about the Ruby McCollum case, a very racist case in the 50s. Judith Halberstam is a queer theorist and wrote about the Brandon Tina trans archive that became Boys Don't Cry, the famous movie. And so I thought about, wow, they actually teach me how to think about women and the body and sex and race and gender in capital cases. And so I guess my question for you is, are you writing about your own, outside of memoir writing, methodologies? And do you also turn to commercial for-profit spaces like eBay and purchase ephemera on your subjects?
I get given things about Ladybird because everybody seems to have a salt and pepper shaker or something about Ladybird. But I'll let you talk about yours. Do you collect?
I don't collect anything because I have this vast archive at my disposal. It may happen, I have a feeling, once the book is published, that people may begin sending me this and that they have a pair of Doris Duke's underpants or something. But but I haven't, and I tend to be a little suspicious of what comes through the ether, particularly in her case because she was so maligned. So that anything that comes to me, I'm going to probably pick up with a pair of tongs.
Well, I actually did buy one thing from eBay for this book. It was at a point where I was doing a particularly what I was thinking of as method biography, where I was trying to cook Shirley Jackson's recipes and drink the drinks that she drank, and watch all the movies she ever mentioned and read all her books. And when her daughter told me that she had used Mitsuko perfume, and I thought, I need to smell what this perfume smells like. So after a little research, I discovered that the formula had been changed. I forget exactly when, in the 70s or 80s. I found someone on eBay who was promising that they had a bottle of the original formula Mitsuko perfume. So of course I bought it. I didn't really like it. So it's still sitting in my desk. But I did have a whiff that suggests that could be something of what Shirley Jackson smelled like.
I'm not buying on eBay. Actually, there was a Joe Hopper painting, one of the ones that Whitney gave away to hospitals, and I tried to buy it for $5,000 on eBay. But actually, I tried to get my husband to buy it. He has a different last name. But my Hopper biography is dedicated to him and the person selling it, who had clearly stolen it from the hospital because they would just walk out, wouldn't sell it because he knew that I knew it was stolen. But I do collect digital images from anyone I did get a digital image of that one in color because all that Joe Hopper left were black and white professional photographs of her artwork. And she left them to the same collection that got the diaries. So they survived. And then I have from the Whitney a list of works that were given away to hospitals and NYU, and only NYU survived. But one of them turned up on eBay. And if you find them anywhere in yard sales, whatever, send me transparencies. Digital images, I collect those.
Okay. Was there a question here? Yeah, just a quick question for Sally. I'm also curious. I know you said Doris Duke about her charitable giving. She gave a lot to modern dance. I know she's also given a lot to jazz. So it's interesting. Is that also related to what? I mean, it's a margin. These are not everybody gives to modern dance and jazz. It's sort of interesting.
She was very interested both in modern dance and jazz. And in fact, she was prominent in the early years of the Newport Jazz Festival. She was one of the people who was able to persuade her more conservative neighbors in Newport to put up with this jazz festival because it was not really what most of them thought they wanted to have right next door. She was, as she grew older, she became more interested in modern dance and was a great supporter of Martha Graham, and in fact did not dance with Martha Graham's company, needless to say, but she did take classes at the Graham studio. And one of the photographs of her is from the back, and she has on one of the black satin exercise jackets with Graham Company across the back. So she did have her own jacket. It was, I think, one of the things that she was sad about, that she never had any real training as a dancer. She was extraordinarily tall, particularly for that period. She was 6'1". And I remember myself growing up rather tall, that there was a real prohibition against tall girls learning anything about ballet and even modern dance. So she never could really participate to the degree that she wanted to, but in terms of her philanthropy, she's been enormously important for dance. I don't know if any of you have been to Jacob's Pillow in Western Massachusetts, but the Doris Duke Theater there is the dance theater. So that's one of the examples of the use of her philanthropy.
Okay, I'd like to thank the panelists very much. I see Sydney's ready to tell us that it's time to go to lunch.
Well, no, I have more restroom information. My husband always says I collect toilet paper because I'm always running to the restroom, so I guess anyway, evidently there was some problem getting access to upstairs restrooms, so we were told there are many, there's restrooms down, as well as on this floor, on the commons level, there are many restrooms or a multi, whatever restroom. So you can use that. Please come back right after lunch. You have a handout of places to eat. You can also bring food back here. I don't know what the weather is doing right now, but we're going to.
Not into the auditorium.
No,
in the
not here.
lounges.
In the lounge across the lobby. You can bring outside food. So, because we're going to start on time.
49.
Yeah, so we only have 1 hour.
I don't know if it's raining, but
I don't know, it
I
was
don't think
raining